the oppressed. You and I are lobbyists for the afflicted.
What does the Lord require? That you do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God.
Welcome to another broadcast of the Black Faith, Black Power podcast. This is Bishop Dwayne Royster, Executive Director of Power Interfaith, Senior Pastor of the Faith United Church of Christ in Washington, D.C., and founder of the Society for Faith and Justice, an ecumenical religious order committed to a charism of social justice as spiritual discipline and spiritual practice. I am excited to be able to bring to you this episode of the Black Faith, Black Power broadcast with our special guest today, the Reverend Naomi Washington-Leapheart, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for several years and also have worked with when we worked at Power some time ago. Let me just tell you about the Reverend Naomi Washington-Leapheart. She is a child of Detroit, but she has chosen Philadelphia. And so we're grateful that she made that choice some years ago. She did her undergraduate degree here at the University of Pennsylvania. She did her Master of Divinity at Lancaster Theological Seminary. For a period after she graduated from seminary, she worked for Power as an organizer and then went to Washington, D.C. to work with the National LGBTQ Task Force as the Faith Works Director. She also started teaching as an adjunct professor at Villanova University, and is an award-winning adjunct professor, not just any adjunct professor, but an award-winning adjunct professor in their theology and religion studies department. And then she really got the offer to come work for new mayor of Philadelphia, Mayor Kenney, to become the director of faith-based and international affairs in the mayor's office. And so we're so excited to be able to sit down and have this conversation today about the Black church, about the role of the Black church in this particular moment, and just to be able to share some more about that. So, Reverend Washington-Leapheart, thank you for being here. We so appreciate you getting up early in the morning to come tape this episode of Black Faith, Black Power. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you, Bishop Royster, for this invitation. And this is always a conversation I enjoy having. So thank you.
Awesome. Today is a bit of a bittersweet day. It is the commemoration of the death of George Floyd. So we are, today's May 25th, and we are remembering, let me make sure today's May 25th, because sometimes I get the dates wrong. Today's May 25th. And, I'm curious, you in your work have been very much a revolutionary, can I say that, a radical, believing in Black empowerment, believing in Black queer empowerment as well. How is this day sitting for you right now?
hmm I have been grieving for more than a year, but certainly for a year. George Floyd, the bottom line is, should still be here, and he's not. And so people have said, oh, his death catalyzed or re-energized a movement, helped some people see what they had been willfully blind to before, etc. But I don't think any suffering or death is, purposed by design. Any tragic death like that, any premature death like that. And so I grieve the loss. I grieve that it takes Black death to make visible what is pervasive for many of us. And I am a person who, I think I'm in the business that I'm in, the business of ministry, because I'm a person who chooses relentless hope, a hope that will struggle through the mess and the noise to break ground and to live in the light. And so I remain hopeful because Blackness is that hope, that relentless hope that decides to persist regardless. And Black folk, particularly over the last year, have shown up and shown out in terms of how we are demanding that our lives actually matter in tangible ways. So it's, like you say, it's bittersweet because I am both mourning the loss, and the losses, not just Mr. Floyd, but so many losses, while I am trying to maintain a hope that refuses to be extinguished.
Let me ask you this question. So in the 1990s, Dr. Cornel West wrote a book called Prophesy Deliverance, which actually was in fact a part about Philadelphia. And one of the things that he talked about was this pervasive sense of nihilism that existed in Philadelphia, right? And this nihilism refers back to this like deep hopelessness, right? Generational hopelessness that exists in a place. And so, when you said that you were thinking about that, you're trying to, be hope. Blackness is hope, and I like the way that you said that, right? How do we as faith communities, having Black faith and Black power, combat that nihilism in this moment when, while we could look back and say Derek Chauvin, was found guilty, and I so appreciate what Attorney General Keith Ellison in Minnesota said. He said this wasn't justice, this was accountability.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, but how do we really come against that deep nihilism that exists in many of our communities, even in people of faith who are sort of like things are never going to change until Jesus comes back? How do we combat that?
Yeah, I was in a conversation just yesterday with someone who was saying, there's a new, I don't know how new it is, relatively new school of thought, theory that has been articulated out of the academy called Afro-pessimism. And the
Mm.
bottom line is that it holds that racism is a permanent phenomenon,
Oh, wow.
that we've gotten to the point where it's so entrenched and so embedded and so ingrained and so quote unquote natural
Mm.
within an American context that it's permanent. Uh, I think that the despair is warranted. I certainly think that um, racism, white supremacy have been, you know, reprobate to use the
Mm.
like King James version word. you know, white supremacy insists on reproducing itself, and it just gains in strength, right? It understands how to shapeshift. It understands how to pivot, how to adjust. Um, but I think that the fact that we are still here,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that I just saw all over my social media over the last week pictures of people graduating, people's Black children
Mm.
graduating, moving on to their next. Um, the fact that we continue to, fire up our grills when we get that one couple of few 80-degree days, and we still play our music loud, and we still line dance, and we still, right? The fact that we are still worshiping on Zoom and people shouting on Zoom, like you cannot COVID us out of our shout, right?
Mm-hmm.
To me, reflects that something else is possible. My friend Dr. Rashawn Crawley would say, otherwise is actually possible.
Mm.
And we're living otherwise in little scenes every day, right? The fact that I'm gonna put on my touch of lipstick today. We in the COVID-19 pandemic or whatever, but I'm on because it makes me feel like I am a dignified human being who's worth it, right? And so I think that my faith is actually what keeps me hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
That we are afflicted on every side, we are cast down, but we are not destroyed.
That's
We
right.
we we do not we are not driven to despair, right? And so hope doesn't mean that we ignore what the reality is, that we don't
Mm-hmm.
state clearly that things are bad and things seem to be getting worse, in fact. But we still find a way to claim joy, to claim space, to claim agency. And if racism is a permanent condition, which I don't know how I feel about this
Sure.
proposal, right? If racism is a permanent condition, that we live and have joy and make family and have friends and succeed despite racism,
Mm.
to me is worth celebration. If I can't do anything about what white folk are doing, what people who subscribe to the tenets and culture of white supremacy are doing, what I can do is make sure I love my people. What I
Mm-hmm.
can do is make sure I love myself, that I love God and serve God, right? So I think the despair is certainly valid given our experience in these yet to be United States. But I think that our existence tells another story. And that's what I want to hold on to.
You're talking about Black joy, right?
I'm talking about Black joy.
You're literally talking about Black joy, right? Our ability to be able to reclaim space and find joy even in the midst of the storms that come or the violence that comes against us at the same time, to be able to find hope in the midst of it all, and the enduring idea that someday we will be able to overcome all these things. I think that that's really, really important. But I want to go back to something else you just said. You said, sometimes it feels like it's getting worse. And I'm wondering, is it getting worse or is it just getting uncovered? How would you look at this moment?
Yeah. In some ways, the fact that people are so bold as to continue to suffocate someone while being filmed
Mm-hmm.
indicates a deeper kind of depravity.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
right.
yes, Darnella Frazier, the 17-year-old who decided to stand there.
Well, God bless her
And
courage. God bless her courage.
you know what I'm saying? She's forever changed. She's forever traumatized.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that she's decided to stand there and record that does expose the brutality in perhaps new ways. But I think there's something particularly depraved when there is a shamelessness about the violence, right? And maybe there was never any shame. Maybe, I'm thinking about our ancestors who lived and died through chattel slavery.
Right.
Nobody was, folks slept well at night knowing that they were keeping people, they were occupying folks. So maybe there was never a shame among folks who practice this kind of violence and brutality. But it seems to me that what we saw on January 6th, what we're continuing to see in daily microaggressions, daily public conversations about this, that folk are proud and unashamed and clear that they will not be held accountable, to Attorney General Ellison's point, for the ways in which they marginalize and abuse and brutalize Black folk. And that to me signals something worse. I'm calling that worse. Because that's harder to, if you shamelessly out here just killing folk and robbing folk of opportunity, and then where is the conscience? What do we have to access, right? So that's why it's going to be really important. It continues to be really important to fight this at the policy level, because we can't rely on white consciousness, clearly.
Right. So, well, let me. I'm going to take it and take us around the corner here for a minute on that. So then, what is the role of the Black church right now? Right. So I'm really fond of saying I don't want to witness. I want to win. So what is the role of the Black church in this moment of dis-ease or disease of the disease of racism and white supremacy in this country? What is the church supposed to be? What's the Black church should be doing right now? What should Black, not just clergy leaders, but the people in the pews?
Yeah. I mean, I think that we have to, first of all, quit cold turkey the addictions that we have to a certain kind of aesthetic faith.
Say more about that.
That's what I hear when you say witness.
Yeah.
Witnessing has become more important than the win. I think that witness is tied to a certain kind of aesthetic. The turn of phrase, the sharp, physical aesthetic of Black churchiness, has seduced us, has swooned us into, I think, a kind of inertia. I mean, I'm not going to call it complacency. I think people deeply care about what's going on in the world, but I think that we have been sort of in slow-mo or stuck, or again in a trance that is rooted in our aesthetic. If the preacher can preach a powerful sermon about social justice, that is so appealing and enticing and titillating that we all leave feeling like we've done the work, right? The preacher leaves feeling like I've done the work. The
If all
people are
you
like,
do is preach a social justice sermon, you haven't done very much. Okay, that's really
right.
that's where I come from on this.
And I think, it's a double-edged sword, because I think part of the beauty of Blackness and Black folk is that we can make that thing aesthetically. We have always had to craft something beautiful out of ashes,
Mm,
right? We've
mm,
had to mold something strong out of, the scraps that we've been given, the leftovers that
sure.
we've been given. And so our ability to create something that's beautifully significant and aesthetically powerful is part of our brilliance. It's part of
Hmm.
our genius, right? But I think that if we rely on just the witness, just the visual, just the audible, right, we will miss out on what you're saying, which is the ability to win. We've got to get more strategic,
Hmm.
less seduced by how it looks, how it feels, right? I mean, we're very embodied. We're sensual people, right?
Hmm.
Again, I love this about us, right? It means that we are in our bodies and feeling when other folk are numb and just, on
Right.
autopilot, right? I think that that's beautiful about us, but I think it has lulled us into, um, as I say, a kind of inertia. We're resting on that. Um, and so we need to be more sophisticated in our approach. It's not just about, oh, did the phrase turn right? Did I shout?
Mm,
It's more about, is this strategic? Um, did this sermon function as the meat, the meal, or
mm,
is this just kind of the appetizer or the pep rally to get us ready to leave this four-wall sanctuary and go and do something,
right.
right? Um, I also think that we aren't leveraging our economic power
Hmm. Hmm.
in a significant way. I mean, I think that, it's still the case that Black folk are, more charitable, more willing to invest in our religious communities, often folks with the the fewest number of resources are the most uh, benevolent,
Hmm.
right? So we're keeping our religious institutions alive financially. What if we could strategically invest that in our own political uprising, our own
Hmm.
political strategy? But that means that we can't get seduced and swindled by the capital project at the church where we're gonna renovate I ain't never been in a church where there wasn't a multi-million dollar capital campaign so that we can make this thing look
Right.
a certain way, feel a certain way. Now, I don't, people shouldn't have to sit on the floor and whatever in church. I mean, I'm not suggesting that, but that seems to be a I don't know if I want to call it misguided investment, but it's certainly maybe an over investment in
Mm,
our, again, aesthetic, you know, buildings and uh, feature, attractive features, and not in our own political liberation,
wow.
which is going to take money. The well-resourced campaigns tend to win. Now, we can argue about that, about the capitalistic nature
Hmm.
of that, but that's the bottom line. And so we need to be more economically sophisticated to invest in our own political liberation as church institutions.
So I hear that piece. So paint for me a picture of what the future prophetic Black church looks like, right? Part of it is I'm not convinced that the future of the Black church is in the four walls of the church. And I'm very much committed to this notion that we need folk that are going to be pastors in the streets and not in church buildings. So paint for me a picture in your own mind about what a powerful prophetic Black church movement looks like going from here forward, right? Not just in the moment, but like here forward, so that we can really create the transformation and change we want to see in the world.
Yeah, this is where I get in trouble because people are like,
Well,
well,
this is
that
a safe
ain't
space.
Christian.
This is a
That
safe
ain't
space.
Christian.
You go ahead and do.
People be like,
This is
that
a
ain't.
safe space.
You know what? I really think that the future Black prophetic church is, I grew up in churches where there was an invitation to discipleship,
Mm-hmm.
right? There was an altar call where the preacher extended their hand and said, would you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior, essentially?
Mm-hmm.
Would you join this church? I want to say that the future Black prophetic church um, is is less invested in whether people become Christians.
Hmm.
I'm just gonna say it like that.
Wow. Say more about that. Come on, break that
That
down. You can't leave that
that
hanging.
well, that's what I'm saying. I get in trouble.
You can't leave that
Um,
hanging.
it feels to me like there are terms by which we still hold people hostage before they can fully be a member, a
Hmm.
member of the congregation, a
Mm-hmm.
member of the faith.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There are holiness tests,
Mm-hmm.
there are metrics, and one of those is, saving souls. Are you on fire for Christ? I mean, before we can go march together, you have to assent to these doctrinal commitments. Are you a Christian in your heart, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I say this as a person who still professes Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, maybe folk, after I say what I'm saying, folk are like, she ain't Christian. That's fine. But I really think that is the barrier, right? Because we are simultaneously living with generations of folk who ain't signing on nobody's dotted line to profess a kind of Christianity contract. They are no less spiritual. They are no less connected to the divine, but they have been disillusioned by, disenfranchised from, excommunicated from Christian institutions. And so I really believe that, when I'm in a protest moment or I'm in a room with organizers and we strategizing about this or that, that's worship. That is church to me. And nobody raises an altar call. Nobody goes around the room and asks, "Are you saved?" Nobody is asking folk to, give the preacher your hand and give God your heart. Like, nobody's doing that. But we have a shared commitment to a certain kind of discipleship. We have a shared commitment to following Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
to the extent that following Jesus means living in a way that upsets the establishment, living in a way that convinces people that they are indeed beloved and valuable, regardless, living in a way that um, helps to meet people's material needs. That's what Jesus did.
Right.
And so I'm really, this is actually the first time I've ever said this publicly. So I mean, I really believe that has to go.
Well, I mean, so I'm gonna push this out because actually, in many ways, I agree with you. So, because part of it for me is that the model of ministry that we have today is a model that came out of the first and second Great Awakening, right? That this theological premise sort of we whether we realize it or not, the model of ministry that we're doing today really comes out of 17th and 18th century evangelicalism,
Right.
and that 17th and 18th century evangelicalism, although not all of evangelicals, but a large portion of them were white supremacists, right? And that they deeply aligned their religious traditions, their writings with and associated the supremacy of sort of white Eurocentric waspish individuals to, Christianity.
Right.
So I often wonder, even today, when we're struggling with younger Black folk being in the church, is it because they can feel the I'm getting ready to make up a word, right? The incongruity of of the faith and their identity as Black human beings, as human beings that have been, as I like to say, whose skin has been kissed by the sun, right?
Mm-hmm.
That there's not an appreciation between the traditions that we have that actually speak to the culture and the DNA that's within us about worship, right? There's something about a baseline that when it comes on, whether you're in Africa or whether you're in the church, right? That baseline hits, something happens to you, and
Right.
it doesn't do it for everybody else, but it does something for us, right?
Right.
And so is part of it because what happens in the street more natural culturally than what happens in the church.
I think so. I mean, I think that the basis for Black faith in the United States has been a kind of critique and resistance.
Mm,
Has That's the basis, because we do read a book that was used to justify our own subjugation, right? And so in order for us to reconcile that, we have had to say, no, I'm gonna come at it from the sides, or no, I'm gonna come at it from the bottom, or I'm going to resist and critique. And that's rooted in a kind of fearlessness,
mhm,
right? I'm gonna take it to God. I'm gonna reckon with God. I'm gonna wrestle with God too.
mhm,
I'm gonna wrestle with these institutions that claim God, right? But what we have inherited and perhaps preserved, to your point,
mhm.
is a kind of faith that is grounded in fear. Those revivals during the Great Awakening were mired in fear-based
Yeah,
theologizing.
that's right. That's right.
Hellfire, brimstone, God's wrath, etc.
Was
Right?
Cotton Mather sinners in the hands of an angry God?
Yes, yes, yes. Jonathan,
Oh, yeah, I know you're talking about.
what's his
I'm getting the
name?
wrong guy.
That's terrible. I assigned this in my classes and I can't
Was it
think of his
Jonathan
last name. But
Edwards? Was it
Jonathan
Jonathan?
Edwards,
Yeah.
Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, right? So that is the antithesis
Mhm,
of Black faithfulness, which
mhm,
is grounded in a kind of fearlessness that I will resist, that I will reckon with God if I need to,
mhm,
that my faith gives me the courage to escape, to be subversive, to have joy, a kind of unspeakable joy, a peace that passes understanding, right? So yeah, I think that that's another that's another feature of the next generation of Black prophetic tradition.
mhm.
Back to a fearlessness and a rejection of fear-based theology, right? If
Right.
I can't love God without being deathly afraid of God, then what kind of relationship is this, right? So yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, it would be nice if somebody preached a sermon, "Children in the hands of a loving God," right? It would
Right.
that would make
Exactly.
that would make maybe you have to go preach that sermon,
Hmm.
or teach a class on that. I'm sure you could do that over at Villanova. I really appreciate that. I would, what message would you give to African American clergy right now, the average layperson sitting in the pew, about engaging in prophetic work to build Black power? What would you tell them that would hope to get them motivated and get them into the fight?
Huh. One of my mentors, Reverend Lanice Pinkert, who came out of AME tradition. Once she came out as queer, she left that tradition and is but is still kind of on fire about her Blackness and her faith. She says to me all the time to encourage me that ain't gonna be no whole lot of us.
Mm,
This is what she says to me, right? Because it's really easy for me anyway to start looking for numbers, and there's we always say there's strength in numbers and there's safety in numbers and all of this, right? And she reminds me it was always a scrappy remnant,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
right? Couple few folks who were willing to follow Jesus all the way to the cross. In his moment of their election, in his moment of agony, in his death, just a few folks gathered at the base of the cross, right? Just a few folks journeying on that Sunday morning to take care of the body, right? And so it doesn't feel like maybe encouragement, but it has been a kind of relief to me that I've appreciated, because when I get discouraged, I just remember ain't supposed to be no whole lot of us. But that don't mean it's not going to be a movement that changes the world. The Jesus movement rocked the world, right? Ultimately, we still sitting here in 2021 talking about what Jesus said and did, right? And so I would say to folks, listen, you put your head down and do your work and stop looking for the folk behind you. Stop counting the folk, not looking for the folk. Stop counting the folk behind you, right? That numbers are not indicative of goodness, of being on the right side of history, right? That's not the power of the message will attract the remnant. And the remnant will be powerful enough to change the world. We got to believe that.
Wow.
We have to believe that we actually have righteousness on our side. And that will prevail if we are strategic, if we invest in our little remnant, if we continue to work. The other thing is, I was reminded in a conversation yesterday of the idea that we're kind of in the work of gardening. I mean, ministry work, political liberation is a gardening task, right? We plant seeds, we water them, we pull up the weeds, right? But we might be tending to gardens, we might be tending to flowers that we will not see fully bloom. Because the bloom actually is not up to us.
Right.
The bloom is not up to the gardener. There are weather elements that attack the, you don't know. There might be some insect infestation
Cicadas.
that we had no control of. Right, cicadas, right? Exactly, right? That the bloom is a phenomenon that happens often, invisibly underneath the surface. We can't really see. And it takes God's hand. It takes the hand of the Holy Spirit to nurture that soil, right? But our task is to get some good soil, get some good seed, plant it in good ground, water it, weed it, maintain it, be vigilant about, and then surrender. And this is the hardest part for me.
Right.
Surrender control over the bloom. We don't have control over the bloom, and we may in fact not see the bloom. So it's kind of like we're itinerant gardeners. We're going and setting up plots and planting seed, planting nourishment for a harvest that we may actually never see. And that's hard. But that's faith. That is faith.
Yeah.
Faith says we have evidence that this will bloom even though we can't see it. Right? When the gardener puts that seed in the ground, the gardener's not, the gardener doesn't have a crystal ball to see what, in fact, but the gardener has faith that, okay, if I trust this process, I know at the end of it, there will be a bloom. Right? And so this is the hardest part for me, but I think it's the most significant part that we have to actually understand. And I know it's frustrating and we tired and oh my God, again, and why we're saying the same thing. I preach the same sermon, in different kinds of ways, using different words, but the same sermon. And it feels like nothing is changing. But if we believe that this process will yield a harvest, will yield fruit, then we keep coming back to the garden and we keep doing it, right? And that's what I learned from my grandmother, watching my grandmother in the garden, right? She would plant, and drag me out there and whatever, and I didn't really understand, right? So again, back to this indigeneity, back to Black cultural tradition, right? Our people knew how to work the land and coax something out of the land, right? And I think that's the work. That's the work. We are coaxing something out of the land.
Wow.
And we just have to have patience and be faithful that the bloom will come.
The Reverend Naomi Washington-Leapheart. Thank you. Wow, that was a great way to end this segment. And I got to get you back because we got a whole bunch of other stuff to talk about that we were supposed to talk about that we didn't talk about that we need to talk about in the near future. But that was a word right there. And as I kept thinking, I'm like, yes, we're gardening a revolution, and it's a revolution of love. That
That's
has
right.
the capacity to transform and change the damn world, as I like to say. So
Mm-hmm.
thank you for that. I'm gonna feast on that for a while. I might actually take that imagery and use it somewhere. I'll give you credit. I'll give you credit though. I'll give you credit. So appreciate that. Everybody, this has been the Reverend Naomi Washington-Leapheart, who is the Director of Faith-Based and Interfaith Affairs for the Mayor's Office of the City of Philadelphia. She's also adjunct professor, award-winning adjunct professor at Villanova University in their Theology and Religious Studies department. I really appreciate you taking the time early this morning to get together here with us on Black Faith, Black Power. And we look forward to continuing our relationship and continuing to build power together to transform the world. We deeply appreciate you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to next time.
All right. Take care.
Thank you for listening to Black Faith, Black Power, produced by Power Interfaith.